If you're a watercolor artist wanting to use drawing oils, here are 5 hard-won lessons I learned through trial and error, so you don't have to waste your time figuring it out yourself, including whether you should ever break the 48-hour rule when spontaneity is on the line. Stay until the end because the last lesson reveals exactly what I decided in that moment.
I want to share 5 things that I've learned over this process. When I was working on the first layer, I relearned that, oh yeah, you have to warm it up. So the last time I used these drawing oils, it was back September and it was still warm. And now it's become chilly here in Washington State. So I have to warm these drawing oils. And that was something that I had to relearn again. You need to warm it up with your hands, and I go back to using this cream just so it protects my hands. I just love the tactile feel of using drawing oil. I have gloves that I can possibly use, but I just love to just feel them in my hands. And of course there was the hard layer, which then I thought, okay, I have to scrape it a bit. And what I did at the beginning, I don't know even why I used my Arches oil paper for this. I could have used just a regular scrap paper or something. But I think using a bit of a tooth, a cold press paper works well because you need to scratch that surface where the wax hardens at the top. The other thing I learned was I did an oil stick review of Phoenix oil sticks, but it's better to cover the area with other mediums like acrylic per se, or even oils, and then use the oil sticks, because at the end of the day they're sticks, right? It's going to be very difficult to cover the whole area. It misses the point of being a stick, because with sticks you can draw and it's intuitive and it's impressionistic and all that. But I think I could have possibly made my life easier by going in with the background with another medium that you can paint. So that was one relearning that I did. I was like, oh yeah, but for this piece specifically, I really wanted to use these drawing oils, period. I did cheat a bit and then use some paintbrushes for details, but I'll get that in a bit. And so the second layer discoveries was pressure. So impasto, limited palette, and missing colors. So what I mean by that, first of all, the impasto. So working while it's wet was really fun. That's the beauty of these drawing oils, is that you feel them blending into the layer that you already laid previously and then going in. We see that Vincent van Gogh and all the impressionists like Monet, had fun doing this because it was quick, it was on the go, outside in the plein air. So it was getting out that feeling, impression of something. So I really enjoyed that element of it, because I learned from my oil stick video that with these sticks you have to love each color, because basically, yes, you can lay that stick on top and put another drawing oil on top and make it into a different color by mixing those colors you lay on top of each other and blend into. But at the end of the day, I believe that you have to love each of these colors. And that's what I did. When I selected these colors from RNFs, I made sure that I love each color. So what I was missing with this Monet piece was that I didn't have any sap greens, because I'm not a huge lover of sap greens or yellows. So I basically stayed away from those, and that basically gave me a limited color palette, because when you see Monet's work with the woman in parasol, you see that elements of yellow as well as greens that I didn't quite have. And even the greens that I used here, I think a phthalo green would have been deeper and rich and better for that. And I didn't also have something close to Van Dyke brown, which is a cool brown. I worked with what I had, and I was able to get close enough to the look of Monet's painting. On the second layer, I worked into some details, and what I did was I placed these drawing oils onto here. This is the key thing that I did learn that I really want to share and wish I thought about a bit, but luckily I only got one really dark color, Payne's Gray. What I mean by dark is in that Monet's Woman in Parasol, the only bit that you see these earthy tones or really deep colors like mass tones is slightly in the hair, in the eyes, in the line of that parasol. When you think about that, you basically only need a bit of these dark colors. And because I'm working on a small piece, you can't really go in there and create the eyes with this, if you know what I mean. So I'm glad I only got a few of these kind, but at the end you do need that color. But if I were to be more selective with my what to buy and I have a budget, I probably will mix my own oil paints that I have. But basically I would scrub this and place that oil onto here, the drawing oil onto here. And then what I would do is I would get a brush. I would tap into these RNF drawing oils with my brush when I needed like quick application of something, which worked, and then just went into the details. So I find those ways of adding details very useful. What's interesting is that being a watercolor artist, yes, there are moments in between layers that I typically wait. And when you're working on different surfaces, like say ampersand's aqua board, I have a video where I experimented on those. But you have to wait longer periods of time between layers and be very slow with your process, which in a way is good, nice, meditative, whatever. But I forget that drawing oils are the same. Even if you're doing impasto way of like painting over wet, what typically happens is at one point I realize I can't do any more layers. Like you just feel it. And the way to feel it, I suppose, is just like everything just blends into everything and it starts mudding things. And that's when I realized I had to step back. So with the clouds, I'm not very happy. And I think partly it was because I was just trying to do it at one go. Really like that impasto feeling of like, maybe I can finish this in one go, but I should have like stopped myself. But anyhow, that was my learnings. It's better to leave these over about 6 hours was the time that I left, and it's quite cool in Washington State right now. It's end of October. It took 6 hours until it didn't completely set, but it was like okay to start working on the second layer. It was hard enough. That was my rework window. And I just feel with these RNF drawing oils, it's not drawing or painting really. It's like sculpting color within this like surface, because I realized that I really had to push to create those Monet impressionistic strokes, because I'm not using my body and like painting with a paintbrush. I find out you really need to push in those drawing oils and even like create like a bodily movement of these strokes to create that feeling, if that makes sense. The colors that I probably would use for Monet is I just love his blues, his whites, and obviously some of that violets in there. So those are the three main colors that I probably use. And I'm going to be painting these with watercolor. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, aren't you gonna use the RNF drawing oils? I will. I'll get to that, okay? But the problem with using the drawing oils on top of the watercolor paper directly is that RNF mentions that it's best for archival practices. What means archival? Archival means so it lasts a very long time, or at least longer than I'm gonna be alive on this planet, is to basically have the surface gessoed. They say, yes, you can use paper, but it's better if you prime it. When I was waiting for the first layer to dry, I went to this book that I borrowed from the library called Monet Giverny. And then the first page that I opened were these lilies. They're called the water lilies. Morning. I thought, why not do a study of this? I wasn't planning to, but I thought, why not? So here I am. I waited for the first watercolor layer to basically dry, and then I went over the piece with Liquitex transparent gesso, and I've used my regular flat brush. And then once that was done, I was going to do just the flowers. and then some areas in the middle. So I was only planning to gesso those areas because that was the only areas I was planning to put the drawing oils. But then while I was doing it, I was like, wait a minute, that's going to be so difficult to narrow down where exactly that gesso is. I'll have to touch it every time and feel it and be like, oh yeah, that's the gesso part. So I was like, nah, I'm just gonna cover up the whole thing. So that's what I did. But what happened was that along the way, I saw that maybe I reactivated the underneath watercolor and then kind of moved it around. So the marks that I made subtly were kind of like disappearing, and I was like, oh, that's not really what I wanted, but it was a good lesson. But somehow, while I was working with the drawing oils, I waited for the gesso to dry for about, I think it was an hour. I should have waited 2 hours, really, because it's quite cold here, but I just went on with it and I started layering. First, it kind of felt good. It has that tooth, so it was really fun working, but the background and the front was just like not really tying in together seamlessly, and I just didn't like the look of it. So then I started covering the whole area with Provence blue as well as the cobalt blue. But like somehow I'm not too happy with this piece, but I think having that watercolor background kind of helped it have like enough coverage to kind of be free to do whatever I wanted. It's just like different from a painting stroke. Like this one, I couldn't create it like a painting stroke because that, like, it's just, you can't really do that with holding a pencil or any kind of stick form. It has to have that brush, like these tips, to basically create those marks. But for what I was able to do, I think I'm kind of happy. Again, I was missing the cadmium yellow. Like I really love that cadmium yellow that's right here, and the cadmium red, I guess that's right here. But I used the quinacridone red and also the John Brilliant to add those warm colors right there. And also I didn't have that olive green kind of look here with the dark green, the cobalt green dark almost. So I used instead the chromium ochre green. But overall, I'm happy. I did my best in order to kind of like match what was here. When I did paint before for a drawing oils video of like without gessoing and also with gessoed paper, I really like the feel of non-primed paper, the non-gessoed one. But actually having that tooth does make sense. It kind of grips those oils into place. And when I want to create those textures, I think it really helps. After finishing this piece of Monet, I realized how much this journey has been about learning to listen to the materials that I have. Let me show you the process. From my previous studies, I realized that I should at least cover up the whole area with watercolor and to make it to the extent that it's okay on its own. So that's what I did, except for the beard area. But after I've done Monet and the moth and the background with the watercolor, then I went over on top of it with the gesso after I let it cure for two days, basically 48 hours. The Liquitex transparent gesso does mention that it's better to let it cure completely for 24 hours to like 48. But I went for the 48, and then once it was dry, I kind of touched the surface, make sure that it was okay, and it has that rough texture to capture the drawing oils. And then the transparent gesso that I laid was only on top of the beard section, because from my previous study that I did, I realized that somehow maybe I kind of put the gesso on too early before the watercolor was completely dry. Maybe that was the reason why when I laid that transparent gesso, it started moving and it looked different. It didn't have that same luminosity that watercolor is known for. Well, it makes sense, right? Because even if it's transparent, it has that tooth. So once you lay the transparent gesso on top of the watercolor, it loses that luminosity of giving you that light from the watercolor paper that's underneath. After that was done, Then I waited for 2 days, and then I went over it with the drawing oils. Now quickly I realized that, oh my god, the drawing oils are quite thick. I mean, I know from using it that it never creates those thin lines. So at the outer edge right here where it meets the collar, you can see very fine lines if you look at the reference photo, and I want to create those. So I used the Gamblin solvent gel, laid it on top of here, cut up some of the drawing oils here and started mixing it, and then I used a very thin brush to then lay on top around this area. But it wasn't as strong in the whites. It didn't pop out as much, and I thought, why am I trying to get precision? Because Monet is more about the feeling, the rhythm. He's almost like confident with the imperfections. That's how I feel when I look at Monet's painting. So I was like, forget it. I'm not gonna do that. I'm just gonna go with the strokes, the rhythm. That's what I'm going after. So I used quite a few colors that I just felt like Monet. Hence, I laid all the colors that I used with watercolor that I felt was Monet on the top. So I have a reference to look back at to choose the drawing oils, because again, drawing oils are basically this color. You have to like the color that you're using. Yes, you can blend, other colors together to get a different feel, but basically this is it. This is your shot. I created some rhythm. Some are more bolder strokes than others. Some are kind of whispery and all that. But overall, I like it. But then I realized that some of these areas, like it needed his hair to stick out a bit with the fine lines. I just went over it with this Caran d'Ache Luminance pencil, the Blanc White, to kind of go over these areas, as well as some of the beard here, to create those thin lines, and I think it worked fine. I also used this Caran d'Ache, the Ultramarine Violet, to go over some of the contour lines just to make it a bit crisp, but that's basically it. So I've used watercolor, I used white acrylic for some of the areas, and then the drawing oils, and then the luminance pencil for this work. But one of the key things I realized is that yes, I laid the transparent gesso on top of some of these areas of the mustache because I knew that I was laying over this RNF drawing oils. But what happened was that while I was in the rhythm of creating this feel of his mustache, I realized that I want to put some of that into his eyes. And I hadn't laid that gesso, transparent gesso, on his eyes. But I just went with it anyway, because somehow I couldn't stop myself from doing it because I knew that it needed that. And some of these things are spontaneous. So then it made me think, wait a minute, should I have laid that transparent gesso throughout the whole painting? I don't think so, no, because I'm gonna lose that luminosity of it. So it's a very tricky balance between planning things ahead to use this mixed media with watercolor and the drawing oils so it stays archival, but there's this spontaneity of feeling of like, this is the direction that I have to take right now. I don't know. What do you think about this? In my next video, I'll be showing what made me cry recently, kind of like dip into this low state that I normally don't have. But happy painting, or happy painting and happy drawing. Bye bye.